Hey there, curious friend. I'm Courtney, a certified peer support specialist, and welcome to Wonderland Unlocked. In this series, Curious Connections, we're diving into the twists and turns of friendships and relationships, exploring trust, growth, and those unexpected moments in between. Because in the world of connections, nothing is ever quite as it seems, but it's always worth unlocking together.
Alice, sweetheart, it's nice to see you. Alice. Alice.
Welcome to Wonderland Unlocked, where we explore the depths of human connection through the lens of Alice in Wonderland. We're diving into one of the most fascinating and often frustrating aspects of relationships, falling into unconscious patterns. You know, those moments when it feels like you're stuck in a loop, where you keep encountering the same issues over and over, whether it's in a romantic relationship, friendships, or even with family. These patterns can feel inescapable, but the thing is, it's not some random occurrence. It's the result of deeply ingrained behaviors often formed in childhood that are playing out in our adult lives. In this episode, we're going to explore the concept of falling into repetitive, unhealthy patterns in relationships, much like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. In Wonderland, Alice's fall is a descent into the unknown, where logic becomes illogical and the world twists into something unfamiliar. And in relationships, our emotional patterns can be just as confusing and disorienting. Today, we'll connect this experience to real-life situations, drawing parallels between Alice's journey and our own struggles to break free from the patterns that no longer serve us. We'll also explore how past experiences shape the way we relate to others and provide insights to how we can start breaking free from these cycles. So grab your cup of tea or coffee, settle in, and let's take a deep dive into the rabbit hole of relationships. When Alice falls down the rabbit hole, she's unsure where she's going. The world around her shifts, things become distorted, and she loses her sense of direction. And much like Alice, when we enter relationships, we can sometimes feel like we're falling into the unknown. Things aren't always what they seem at first, and often we don't even realize that we're descending into unhealthy patterns until it's too late. Think about the first time you fell for someone or began a close friendship. How easy was it to get swept up in the excitement? Maybe you ignored red flags because the connection felt so intense, or you believed that the other person's actions were just misunderstandings. It felt exhilarating, didn't it? Everything seemed possible, like you just stepped into a world of endless potential. But much like Alice in Wonderland, who finds herself confused and unsure about what's real and what isn't, we too can become disoriented when it comes to relationships. The rush of our emotions, the desire for closeness, can cloud our judgment, and we often don't notice how quickly we've descended into patterns that are far from healthy. Think back to the moments when you may have found yourself questioning things in a relationship. Maybe it was when things started feeling off, but you couldn't quite pinpoint why. Maybe it was when you found yourself tolerating things you never thought you would, or compromising your own needs for the sake of keeping the peace. Relationships, like Wonderland, can seem full of strange twists and turns, and it can feel like there's no clear way out of them. The truth is, we've all fallen into unconscious patterns at some point, and in relationships, these patterns often repeat themselves without us even noticing, like a loop we're stuck in. These patterns are shaped by our past experiences, things we may have learned in childhood or from earlier relationships. For example, we might have learned to give too much of ourselves to others because that's how we received love as children. Or maybe like Alice, we become so lost in the world of relationships that we lose track of ourselves along the way. We can become disconnected from our own needs and emotions just like Alice, who gets swept into the chaos of Wonderland. We might also notice that we avoid difficult conversations in relationships, or we may shy away from confrontation for fear of rejection or anger. It can feel easier to stay silent than to rock the boat, even if it means suppressing our own truth. Or perhaps we've been in relationships where we start pushing people away, even when we deeply care about them, out of fear of being hurt. Maybe we've been hurt before, and we're scared that that same thing will happen again. These are all common patterns we might find ourselves falling into. Let's pause and think about a few common patterns we might fall into. People pleasing, often rooted in childhood experiences. This pattern involves prioritizing others' needs above your own, seeking approval or love through self-sacrifice. It's that feeling of needing to constantly make sure everyone around you is happy, often at the expense of your own well-being. Maybe it's because we're taught growing up that love meant putting others first. It can feel so familiar, like an automatic response, but it doesn't leave much space for our own needs. Avoidance. This pattern often emerges when we're afraid of conflict. If confrontation feels too threatening, we may retreat, put up walls, or try to avoid any tension at all. This can look like shutting down emotionally, pulling away, or not addressing issues until they blow up. We often avoid dealing with our feelings because we fear that expressing them will push people away. But avoiding difficult conversations doesn't solve anything. It only buries the emotions, making them harder to address later. Self-sabotage. This is a tricky one because it often happens subconsciously. We might push people away even when we want to be close to them. Maybe we start arguments for no reason, act distant, or find reasons not to commit fully. It's almost like we're preparing ourselves for rejection before the other person even has the chance to reject us. We might not even realize that we're doing this, but deep down, we're protecting ourselves from the possibility of getting hurt, even if it means sabotaging something that could be good for us. These patterns can feel like invisible forces pulling us down into a hole, making it difficult to find our way out. Alice, too, feels pulled into the chaos of Wonderland, unsure of what's happening around her, or how to navigate it. But just as Alice learns to question the world around her, we can learn to question our own behaviors and patterns in relationships. Awareness is the key to breaking free from them. Recognizing these patterns is the first step. It's like Alice coming to the realization that she no longer is in the place she thought she was. She had to learn to make sense of the chaos and find a way to navigate it. Similarly, when we identify our patterns in relationships, we are beginning to untangle the mess of unconscious behaviors that have held us in a repetitive loop. Once we see these patterns, we can begin to make intentional choices about how we want to show up in our relationships. It's about consciously choosing healthier ways to connect, ways that align with who we are today, not who we were in the past. Now, let's talk about how we can begin to climb out of this metaphorical rabbit hole. We can start by recognizing that these patterns are not permanent, and that we don't have to keep falling into the same traps. We have the power to rewrite our relationship scripts, to learn from our past, and to create new, healthier patterns moving forward. But it all starts with acknowledging that we're in the rabbit hole in the first place. And, much like Alice, who begins to understand that she has the ability to shape her journey through Wonderland, we too have the ability to shape the way we move through relationships. The path to self-awareness, to breaking free from unhealthy patterns, is a journey, a process that takes time, patience, and self-compassion. By exploring the patterns we fall into, we can begin to navigate our relationships with intention and clarity, and eventually step into a new world, one where we no longer feel lost in the chaos, but empowered to build meaningful, healthy connections. As Alice ventures through Wonderland, she's constantly confronting parts of herself she hadn't known existed. Many of the patterns we fall into in relationships stem from our childhood experiences, often rooted in how we were raised or the kinds of emotional lessons we learned growing up. When we look at relationships through the lens of our past, it's clear that the way that we were treated, loved, or neglected as children shapes how we show up in relationships today. These early experiences often create unconscious blueprints for how we interact with others. It's as if our childhood experiences lay the foundation for everything we learn about love, trust, and connection. For instance, if we were raised in an environment where love was conditional, where we had to earn affection or attention, we might find ourselves falling into relationships where we constantly feel we need to prove our worth to others. We might believe that love is only valid when we meet certain expectations, or that affection can only be earned through actions or accomplishments. This might lead us to overlook partners who are emotionally available or healthy, and instead gravitate towards those who validate our sense of self-worth through their approval or lack of approval. It's a pattern that mirrors the feeling of Alice constantly having to adapt and prove herself to fit into the wonderland she doesn't fully understand. We end up in relationships where we are desperately trying to fit into someone else's world, even if it's not our own. It's not just about childhood trauma either. Positive experiences shape us too. Think about a time when you felt truly loved and supported. Maybe it was a time when your parents or caregivers made you feel safe, heard, and valued. If you ever had an emotionally supportive family where communication was valued, you might find yourself seeking relationships with those who value the same things. Maybe you learned that conflict doesn't have to be something to fear, that expressing your feelings could lead to understanding rather than rejection. This could lead you to seek relationships that are more open, transparent, and communicative. You are naturally drawn to environments that feel familiar. Those where emotional connection is safe, where honesty is cherished, and where love isn't transactional, but unconditional. On the flip side, if you grew up in an environment where your emotions were dismissed, or where silence was the answer to conflict, you might now retreat when relationships get tough. Perhaps, like Alice, you've learned to retreat inwardly, pulling away from situations when things start to feel overwhelming, or when you're faced with confrontation. Instead of engaging with a partner or a friend when things are challenging, you might shut down, or withdraw, or avoid the issue altogether. This is a direct reflection on how you were conditioned to cope with emotional discomfort as a child. If there was no safe space to express your feelings or work through disagreements, you might have learned to suppress them, thinking that withdrawing is the best way to protect yourself. The truth is, much like Alice's adventures, our past can feel like a maze, with paths that seem familiar and others that are entirely new. We might get lost in old patterns, retracing steps we've taken countless times, or we might stumble upon unfamiliar territory where we feel confused, vulnerable, or uncertain. But understanding that these patterns were formed out of survival or coping mechanisms can help give us a sense of control. We don't have to be trapped in these cycles forever. The fact that we're aware of them is already a step towards breaking free. It's helpful to remember that many of our patterns, whether healthy or unhealthy, were developed because they served a purpose at one time. As children, we didn't have the emotional tools to navigate difficult situations, so we created these coping mechanisms to help us manage our feelings and our environment. And while some of these coping mechanisms might have served us well in the past, they don't always work in adulthood. Just like Alice, who learned to question the rules of Wonderland as she grows, we too can question the patterns we formed over time. For example, let's take the people-pleasing pattern. If you grew up in an environment where attention was given when you were good or when you made others happy, you might have learned to prioritize others' needs over your own in order to receive love or approval. This pattern might have worked as a child because as a child, love and attention might have felt conditional. But as an adult, it can leave us feeling emotionally drained or underappreciated or unfulfilled in relationships. The first step toward breaking free of these patterns is recognizing them, understanding where they came from, and accepting that we are not defined by them. Alice too learns that she is not trapped in Wonderland forever. She is capable of navigating its chaos. Likewise, we have the power to reframe our relationship with our past and take conscious steps towards healthier patterns. But recognizing these patterns doesn't mean that we automatically know how to change them. In fact, it's often difficult to break old habits even when we know that they're harmful. Change takes time, and we have to be patient with ourselves. It requires a deep willingness to confront those uncomfortable, often painful truths about our past and how they influence the present. But just like Alice, who has to face the many challenges and adversities before discovering her own strength, we too can find the strength within ourselves to overcome the unconscious patterns that no longer serve us. To make lasting change, it helps to reflect on how we want to show up in our relationships today. Are there specific qualities or values that we want to prioritize? Do we want to move away from the patterns of people-pleasing or avoidance and instead cultivate healthier dynamics? The beauty of our experiences is that they don't define who we must be. We are constantly evolving. As we dive deeper into our understandings of how our childhood shaped us, it's also important to remember that we have the ability to rewrite the narrative. Just like Alice was able to alter the course of her journey, we too can choose a new path in our relationships. This process is about taking ownership of our behaviors, acknowledging where they come from, and deciding to act differently moving forward. It's a journey that doesn't happen overnight, but each small step counts towards breaking free from the old patterns and creating healthier, more fulfilling connections. If you take a closer look at the characters in Alice in Wonderland, you'll find reflections of common relationship dynamics. Let's take a moment to explore how some of these characters mirror the behaviors we might fall into. The White Rabbit is always trying to rush around, frantic and distracted. In relationship, this could symbolize the tendency to chase after the next big thing, avoiding deeper connections because we're constantly looking for something else, perhaps out of fear that we're stuck in one place. We might avoid commitment or stability because it feels suffocating. The Queen of Hearts, the Queen's temper and need for control, might remind us of relationships where power dynamics are skewed. In these relationships, one partner might dominate, making decisions for both and using anger or manipulation to get their way. The Queen represents the destructive nature of unchecked authority in relationships. The Cheshire Cat often shows up and disappears, offering cryptic advice. This can be likened to a pattern of emotional withdrawal in relationships. Perhaps we engage deeply at first, only to disappear when things start to get too real or vulnerable. These characters serve as metaphors for the patterns we might fall into, patterns that keep us trapped in cycles of behaviors we might not even recognize. But understanding these patterns is the first step in breaking free. Now, let's talk about how we can start to break free from these patterns. Just as Alice has to make difficult decisions and challenge her surroundings in Wonderland, we too need to challenge the unconscious patterns that govern our relationships. Here are some steps to start that process. Self-reflection. Take the time to reflect on your past relationships, romantic or otherwise. What are the common threads? Are there behaviors or reactions that repeat themselves? Journaling or talking with a therapist can help uncover these patterns. Recognizing triggers. Often, we fall into patterns because we're triggered by past experiences. Maybe someone behaves in a way that reminds us of someone from our past, and our old coping mechanisms kick in. By becoming aware of these triggers, we can choose to respond differently rather than unconsciously reacting. Setting boundaries. Healthy boundaries are essential in any relationship. Setting boundaries within ourselves and others helps us break free from the cycle of people-pleasing or self-sabotage. Boundaries allow us to show up authentically and protect our emotional well-being. Therapy and support. It's difficult to break out of long-standing patterns without help. Seeking therapy, either individually or as a couple, can be an invaluable tool in reprogramming our rational patterns. Sometimes we need someone else to point out what we can't see on our own. Practice mindfulness. Mindfulness can help us stay present in our relationships. Instead of falling into automatic reactions, mindfulness helps us pause and make intentional choices in how we show up. Just as Alice's journey is one of learning, growing, and adapting, so is our journey in relationships. Breaking free from patterns takes time, but it's a necessary part of creating healthier, more fulfilling connections. As we close today's episode, remember that falling into unhealthy patterns in relationships doesn't mean that you're destined to repeat them forever. The first step, as always, is awareness. By recognizing the rabbit holes we've fallen into, we can take the first step towards getting out of them. The road to breaking free from these cycles may feel like Alice's descent into Wonderland, disorienting, confusing, and even chaotic at times. But just like Alice, you have the ability to make choices, learn from your experiences, and ultimately navigate through it all. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the rabbit hole of relationships. If you resonated with today's episode, feel free to share your thoughts, experiences, or questions you have. I'm always here, ready to listen and continue this journey with you. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, just because you're falling doesn't mean you can't land on your feet.